Hello and welcome to Remembering George Floyd, how to talk to young children about racialized trauma and healing. My name is Dianne Haulcy. I host a podcast called Early Risers, all about raising children with a clear-eyed understanding of cultural differences, race, and implicit bias. I've been a leader in the field of early childhood for over 25 years, and I come to this role as a mother, as an early childhood professional, and as someone who believes we can teach our children to do better. Nearly 2 years ago, a man named George Floyd had his life snuffed out of him by a police officer in South Minneapolis. Although I am born and raised in the Twin Cities, this event affected me and many others in a very personal way. In part because I am currently raising young African-American teens that, like George Floyd, are tall and big in stature. I wanted a better reality for them and for other Black and brown bodies. As I processed the event, it became clear to me that there was something happening in Minnesota and in America that gave permission to a white man to devalue the humanity of a man of color, and that his permission was not granted solely because he was a police officer. It was granted probably when he was very young, and those that granted it to him may not have even realized what was happening. Not wanting his death to be in vain, after fully processing my thoughts in an open letter to the early childhood community, I worked with Little Moments Count and NPR to launch the Early Risers podcast in 2021 to help parents and caregivers understand how children are not born racist, but they begin to develop their racist ideologies very early, much earlier than most people think. And as Buffalo, New York, and the country are still reeling and mourning the murder of 10 Black bodies as they were simply shopping at the grocery store on Saturday, the murder by an 18-year-old young man, I am even more convinced of our need to address this early on. My dream is that as parents and caregivers, we could teach our children how to have the conversations about race that we struggle to have, in the hopes that they will be able to dismantle racism. Before we begin, I want to thank Health Partners and Think Small for their support in making today's event and the upcoming season of Early Risers possible. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce our guests today. First, we have Melanie Adams. She's the director at the Smithsonian Institute at Anacostia Community Museum in Washington, D.C. And before that, Melanie was the Senior Director of Guest Experience and Educational Services at the Minnesota Historical Society. Next, we have Cynthia Carter. She lives in Minneapolis, and she is a wife and grandmother to 10 children from ages 3 months to 30 years. She grew up in the civil rights movement and has experienced firsthand the fight for civil rights. She is active in her community and believes in teaching children to work towards a life goal. Next, we have Brandon Jones. He's a psychotherapist, professor, and behavioral health consultant. He's the executive director of Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. And last but not least, we have Rebecca Nathan. She's been sharing learning with caregivers in the community for over 15 years. Rebecca is also the owner of Avila Curriculum and Consulting, an equity-focused firm that supports others in cultural competency. This conversation today is about how we talk to young children about racialized trauma and healing. After George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, the site of his killing became a community gathering space for memorial, for protest, for conversations about policing, for reflecting, and for healing. In a few moments, I'm going to take you by video to George Floyd Square at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis. But first, I want to talk about the importance of these spaces. So I'm going to start with a question for Melanie. From your standpoint, having a career in educational services for historical sites and museums, what are these spaces for, and what can a young child learn from visiting them?
Well, I think the importance of place cannot be, I think, undervalued. And what we're really seeing here is I've normally worked with historic spaces, and we're seeing all of these new types of spaces pop up. And I also want to be clear that these are not new phenomenons. When I was had the privilege of seeing the videos early, I was thinking about the stuffed animals kind of memorials that you see along the sides of the road when people have been killed. And so this is something that communities of color have been doing. And I think this recognition really helping kids understand something important happened here. And something that probably needs to be discussed. And some of the things I really think about is you have to prepare kids to enter these spaces appropriately. And I think the power of the space really allows you to better tell the story. It's one thing to read it in the book. It's something else to go to the actual site and walk in the space where that person may have taken his or her last breath.
Yes, that is so, so true. And we certainly felt that about a week and a half ago when we visited George Floyd Square. You feel it in your body. And so, as I mentioned, I actually visited the space about a week and a half ago with Sheila Williams Ridge. She's a colleague and a friend of mine, but she's also the co-director of the Child Development Laboratory School at the University of Minnesota. So I'd love to share this first quick video with you all. We are now standing in front of the site where George Floyd was actually murdered. And there's signs all over that are reminding us of how much this is a sacred space. A Black man was murdered by a police officer right here in this space. First of all, many people would ask, would you even bring a child to this space to talk about that? And if so, what would you say?
Yeah, so it's a hard space to come to. I think that I would definitely come without children first if you haven't been here before. Yeah. I think that would be important to be able to be present for a child when you brought them here. Yes. So to come here to process it, it will still feel heavy every time you come. Talk to children before you come here about what to expect, and they're going to ask a lot of questions about, the stuffed animals. Yeah. They may want to, sometimes you can say before you come, like sometimes people bring something special that they would like to leave there. Tell them about what the space is. Tell them a little bit about what happened, that someone died here, someone killed them, and it was, a police officer.
And there are images in some places of police officers. Correct. Here, so
yes.
They may recognize those images.
Exactly. So I think having a conversation about the job of police.
That's really good. And I also want to point out that the conversation you have might be different if you are a parent of color or parenting a child of color than a white parent or parenting a white child. Because I imagine that part of the conversation of a child of color might be, will this happen to me? And I have heard anecdotally of young children after George Floyd's murder, they wonder, will this happen to me? Or will this happen to my father? Will this happen to my brother or cousin or someone in my family? Mm-hmm. And that is a really hard question to answer, but it's also a really important question to answer because it speaks to a child's safety, and that's a core need for children, is to feel safe.
When I answer that question, I have to be truthful,
yes,
but also hopeful. In the world, we have to think about how we navigate, and so we have to share that with our children.
And if you are a white parent or parenting white children, the conversation shifts.
The white families that I know have found it really important to have the conversations about, how we have this, this sign in our yard that says like Black Lives Matter, and we talk about how we love people that look all sorts of different ways. We're going to go to a place, and what happened there wasn't what we believe is true of the world, but someone else, hurt someone, and this is what happened, right? And so you figure out a way that makes sense with the context of your child's background.
And one thing that we can now say, at least, is that the officer that did this went to prison.
Correct. So what happened here, he did something that he was not supposed to do. People agreed this was wrong, and he has to go to jail.
Thank you. At the end of that video clip, Sheila Williams-Ridge and I were talking about the consequences of actions. She gave a great example for how to help a young child empathize with justice. So imagine, for instance, if someone took something from you. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I want to start with Brandon. And I'm hoping that you can kind of give us a basic understanding of how children from birth to like 3 or 4, how do they process information? We know that young kids are starting to put people and things into mental categories to help them make sense of the world. So how do these bigger community events like the death of George Floyd impact a small child? And how might that show up in their actions?
Big question. I would say for the most part, 0 to 4 years old, many young people aren't going to understand the full context of what went on, but they will feel how the adults around them, the other children around them, the people around them are responding. And that's one big thing that both parents, caregivers, and family and other members around kids should pay attention to is how are they having these conversations around the young kids? How are they responding, both physically and emotionally? If you're getting very visibly upset and angry and yelling at the TV, children are watching that and they will emulate that, and they might not understand why, but they see this as a behavior that other folks are doing, so they will resemble that as well. So it's important. But as they feel those things, they're also processing in their bodies as well. So they might not always understand the context of what's going on around them, but again, they are still soaking up what's happening within the environment and how that environment is playing a role in their development. Now, what does that do to their, to their emotional states at that very young age? They can have a lot of hypervigilance at that young age, right? There's a lot of activity going on. They may be a little bit more hyper aware. It could, depending on how severe things are, if you're having someone who's really going through it, really stressing out, it could impact their psychosocial and motor development as well. Hopefully it doesn't get to that level of trauma, but we know that there were people who lived in South Minneapolis as everything that happened after George Floyd, and what's going on for those children who were, from 0 to 4, how did they respond to the loud noises outside, to the smoke in the environment, to the sirens going off throughout multiple times during the day. So there are different types of impacts based on the environments that these young people are in.
That is so interesting. And one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking is that, us as adults, we have these reactions, whether it be anger and sadness, and our young children are watching it. So there may be times it's good to stop and say, hey, mom or dad or whomever, I am upset and this is why, to kind of narrate kind of situations for them, even though they may not fully understand the whole of it. For one, making sure that they know it's not them, because young children often, will internalize things. And so just to let them know, I am not angry at you. You have done nothing wrong, but there's something out there in the world that is really upsetting me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I want to talk to Cynthia a little bit about that, to follow up on that. So I understand that George Floyd Square is actually right across the street from where you attend church. And so what were your conversations like with your younger grandkids about George Floyd? And did you actually take your children to George Floyd Square at any time?
Well, actually, I did not. I didn't take them there. From what happened with George Floyd's murder, I actually witnessed the whole thing. And sometimes when you witness certain things and it turns out, real big like this did, you got to kind of weigh things out to know what you want to do and when you want to do it. I'm up at in the area quite a bit because our church is right across the street from there. But I haven't brought them up there to talk to them about it. I have talked to them without bringing them there, but I have not brought them up there. When I was up there the other day, I actually, because I don't always walk across the street and look, but I actually did do that the other day, and I was like, wow, it's so much stuff. I didn't realize how much stuff, because we're around it all the time. So I didn't realize how much stuff was there, and it's quite a bit. I know that we were our pastor said that we were in a gated community because we were cut off from driving to our church. We couldn't actually drive there and park like we wanted to, because there was so many gates. Everything was blocked off, blocks out, 37, 38, Chicago, Park Avenue, all those streets were blocked off. And, you know, it's when you have trauma like that, it's really, really hard to share that with young people.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Cynthia. I want to kind of, you know, talk about what you just said, because you actually witnessed it. You know, you are going through your own process of trying to deal with this trauma that happened, and you know, having the wisdom to kind of separate that from, you know, your children, or protect your children, you know, from that. And I think that's a good point, because I think for us as adults, witnessing something like the murder of George Floyd was very hard for many of us. And so we have to kind of, and our children, as Brandon was saying, they are watching, they are absorbing our, whatever it is that we're feeling, they are absorbing that in their bodies. So it's good to be real clear and protective if you're not quite ready because of what you have experienced to go there. That is okay. Listen to your body, listen to make sure you get what you're, and in that you are so modeling to young children. You know, I'm not ready to go. So when they know that if they should listen to their instincts and their bodies when trauma happens, so that's a lot of wisdom in that. And so when you actually did talk to them, I heard you say you did talk to them about it. What were the kinds of things you said to them?
I just talked, because, you know, it was all over. So I just talked to them about, there was an incident that happened across the street from the church where this guy was murdered by the police. And I was telling them that a lot of times we go through certain things with the cops as people of color. And if we were to, now I learned some stuff from the class that I'm in with Rebecca, and not knowing that, because you don't think about the brain activity, okay?
Right.
So whenever something happens with people, if you're in protective mode, you're not going to be able to respond the way you need to. As far as your thinking's not going to be there for you to be able to be calm and say the right thing. And so I was telling them, without knowing that you have to allow yourself to be calm and not go off and don't do that. You know, just listen and comply, because you never know how the outcome would be, because they don't really know what's happening with themselves. So if you're constantly going off or saying something, they're going to take offense. So their survival mode is in action too. So we have to really be careful and make sure we just comply. You know, my hands are up, I'm listening to you, whatever you're saying. And if you're calm, then you can later you can say later, after they're done doing what they have to do as cops.
Yes.
Then you can say, why did you pull me over? Or why did you know what I'm saying? So then it's more calm. And so things shouldn't, you know, happen real bad from that. And I know a lot of people have said that and things still happen, but I think that if all of us know and understand what really goes on with the brain when things are happening, things will come up a whole lot better. And I just learned this a couple of weeks ago. And that's a shame. I'm 62.
There is so much wisdom in what you just said. And I know I've had to have some similar conversations with my boys as well. But I want to turn to Rebecca, because Cynthia talked about what she learned from the groups that she is in with Rebecca. And I know that, Rebecca, you are working with kind of a cross-generational group of parents, grandparents. So can you tell us a little bit about what do you all, what are some of the useful ways, useful things that you talked about that you found to have these conversations with children and caregivers of all generations about race?
Thanks, Anne. I think about it in two ways. Like one, in terms of what are we going to say right now about this specific situation, which many of the panelists have addressed. I also think it's really important to think about the long game, right? Because this is something that is continual. And so I try to support adults to have an understanding about like the system and the process and how they're managing that and their own discomfort with that, because the more that they do that work, the more they're naturally, like inherently skilled to have the conversations, because we know that George Floyd is tragic and not the only situation. And so I think it's important to encourage people to not make this like a finite, what do I say about this one thing? But as adults to continually like engage and build their own understanding and skill set about how they think and feel about it, that would translate in terms of not just what they're saying, but how they show up in those discussions with children.
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, I know you have several children as well. What are some of the things that you said to your children, or what are some of the things you have talked about with your children?
Yeah, when I was listening to Cynthia, I was reminded that it's this complex thing, like twofold, right? Because I definitely have had the conversations about increasing your chances of survival, right? Like all the things that you want to do that Cynthia named. And I try to do that in a way that's not messaging to my children that somehow you're responsible, right? Like if you would have just been more calm, then it was George Floyd's fault or something like that. So I try to also I did talk to them also about the bigger picture and the systemic things that are wrong, and that people are working hard to try to fight against that. And it's a long journey. And so I talked to them about like the bigger picture systemic things that are just wrong and not right. And also, in the meantime, these are things that are important for us to think about as we're trying to unravel these harmful racist realities.
That's good. Brandon, I want to shift to you a little bit as this conversation is unfolding, because one of the things that we talked about in the video is children's safety. It's real important for children to feel safe, for them to have good development. But when things like this happen, it rocks our whole worlds, and this idea of safety becomes very fragile. So can you talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you can say, even in the midst of traumatic events like the murder of George Floyd? What are some of the things you can say to kind of continue to let children know that they are safe?
Absolutely. And it's even more important given the context of what happened to George Floyd, because a lot of young children are told that police officers are there to protect them, and how they learn is good guys versus bad guys and things of that nature. So when things like this happens, there's a lot of conflicting messages going on for kids. So if the cops are supposed to be there to, get the bad guys and not the good guys, like, what does that mean to me when the bad guys look like me? So a lot of the messaging that we have to deliver to our children is, one, undoing some of that confusion, but then also giving some hope and reassurance that they can be okay. There are so many children in communities all across the state that don't feel safe anywhere. They don't feel safe at school. They don't feel safe at home. They don't feel safe out in the community. And that's a huge problem for us. And how do we counter those messages when the realities for them aren't necessarily showing up? For myself, I'm a father. I have 3 daughters. One of the things that I always tell them is that, you always have to pay attention to your surroundings, but you are safe, and you are safe. You will be okay. And if things don't feel right, that's when you come to a trusted adult, your parent, whoever, to kind of say, hey, something doesn't feel right, or you come home if a trusted adult's not there. So making sure they know, where to find safety, what to do in those spaces is important. That's not the case for every young person. Sometimes young people feel like they're out there on their own. So you have to teach them protocols and things of that nature on how to pay attention. Do you have access to a phone where you can call somebody if things go, don't feel right? Do you know where the closest place to go to if things feel uncomfortable? Do you know your way home? Do you know your address? Like, these are important things that we do have to tell our children so that they can prepare to be safe. But safety is a very scary thing. And I think that one of the goals and one of the things that we should be doing as parents and caregivers is really making sure that we're just giving proper information to our kids so that they can feel safe as possible, but we can't guarantee it. Unfortunately, in this world, it's hard to do that.
Yeah, it is. But being able to talk about it with your child, I think, is really, really important. Just as you said. And I want to turn now to, thinking about these spaces. I want to talk to Melanie for a bit because, as we watched the video, we saw all kind of images, whether it be stuffed animals, posters and murals that were made, and it's all been created by community. Things have, just popped up, and as opposed to being created by an institution. And so can you talk a little bit about the importance of that, that this is a space, a sacred space that's been created by community?
I think, that's really important because when I look at what was created there, they also show signs of resilience. And I think that's what we were talking about when we're talking about giving children hope in these spaces, and it shows community. So this person was loved enough that people came and surrounded him, even in his death, and created a sense of community in that space. And I think what kids are able to take from that, I think, as Brandon has said, there are adults who will look out for you. So it's not all doom and gloom, for lack of a better term. But I think those spaces really allow for that community to gather. And I think one of the things that historic sites can do, whether it is something more recent like George Floyd, or even with Michael Brown and Ferguson, or even something like in your own backyard, historic Fort Snelling at Bdote, you are able to see a pattern and a legacy of how people of color have been treated. So that's what I always feel is really important, is this isn't a one-off event. And I think being able to talk about how people of color have been treated in this community will allow children to see some type of connections. And I think that's really important. So everyone keeps talking about things being random. Things really aren't that random. There is a structure. And I think even Rebecca talked a little bit about the institutional racism that underpins this country. And I think what we do at our historic sites is we really talk about that. When kids go to historic Fort Snelling, they're going to learn about the Dakota people and the genocide that took place in the state of Minnesota. Because how can you learn about Minnesota without learning about the first people there and what happened to them, and that they currently live there as well? So the place-based education, I think, is just so important for providing legacy. But as I mentioned early on, it's really just centering people in a space where the things actually happened. And as you mentioned, Dianne, the feelings that come over you while you were there to help you understand and hopefully process that.
Yes, thank you for that, Melanie. And as I was listening to you talk, it also reminded me that the way that George Floyd Squares and places like that pop up, it's really giving voice to community too, that people are able to bring their voice, and just the act of being able to create that space begins to start our healing. So I just want to mention that right now that many of you might have questions in the audience, and we're going to save time for that at the end. So you will get a time to ask questions, but feel free to start asking them now. Drop your questions in the chat, and we're going to be collecting them and answering them at the end. As a reminder, our podcast is called Early Risers, and it's produced by Minnesota Public Radio for Little Moments Count, which is a statewide movement to help parents and the community understand the importance of talking, playing, reading, and singing early and often. So we've all kind of been pointing towards this notion of healing during our conversation. And I want to say, This is a real important piece because we can't leave children with just the, or anybody, but especially children, we can't just leave them with the dread of what has happened. So let's kind of pivot and start talking about how do we heal? How do we bring hope to the situation? We're going to watch another clip from my visit to George Floyd Square with Sheila Williams-Ridge. We're going to talk about how you might bring a young child to a place like this, and what are some of the things that you might say and do with them.
For a lot of young children, they've never been to a cemetery. Say, okay, we're going to go to a place, it's kind of like a cemetery, but not the same. We're remembering them, but the people aren't here. We put up some signs so that we don't forget people, so that we can remember them.
People have come to mourn, they've come to heal. And so there's a lot of things that have just popped up in this community, and these flowers are one of them.
These flowers are a really wonderful way to engage children, giving them things that they can touch, that they can, look at the flowers and they can notice, like the life that's going on around them. I think it helps them kind of put something tangible in. And when they see like that there are some things that are the same, right? Black Lives Matter is on every single one, but there are special names that really pull out an individual. And I think talking with young children about the individual people and what they contributed to the world is really important. And they'll ask questions that sometimes adults find really hard, like, well, what happened to them?
Yes.
And then, depending on the age of the child, you'll just want to prepare an answer. Can I take this home with me is probably a very frequent question.
Yeah.
And, we say, oh, this actually will stay here so that every time we visit and other people visit, that they can think about these people and that we miss them, right? This is a place where we can come and say, we miss these people. We wish they were still here. Also, nature has a lot of power to heal. And so having the symbol of flowers, with this art, but also like real things that are blooming behind, I think just infuses a feeling of hope for people that it can get better. I think this is a space that we want to think about with a lot of reverence, that we want to say, this is special. So when we come here, we're probably not going to run around too much. We're going to really be thoughtful about what we're doing. And so I think it's important before coming here to talk about what this place is a little bit. So just telling children, like, we're going to go to a place where something, really bad happened to someone. We want to go and remember them. We want to go, it's a really special place. So while we're there, you'll stay with me, but I'll let you have a chance to look at things. And I want you to ask questions when we go. So if there's something that you don't understand, you can ask me. But I think, talking about like that someone died here and it was really sad.
This is a wide open space.
Yes.
So young children will come and they may want to just run down there, and run through. And so what should we tell young children?
We're trying to feel better. We're trying to heal a little bit from something really bad that happened. So we're going to walk through kind of quietly, and we're going to be really thoughtful. And if we see other people that are maybe sitting by one of these and thinking about someone special, we're going to try and be really quiet when we go by them.
In that video, Sheila Williams-Ridge offered several tips for how we might help a child process visiting a space like George Floyd Square, such as taking a picture and bringing it home, bringing a small item to the space, to be able to draw, create art together. As you're thinking about young children, maybe that you have worked with or that are in your life, and this question is for the whole group, everybody, what are some of the things that you might add to that list? What are some tips that you might give to parents of how to start the process of healing for a young child?
I'll jump in there. I think that this opens a great opportunity to start traditions of grief and being able to memorialize people in our lives. A lot of families don't really have customs on how we grieve, and people pass and we show up to funerals or, going ways, and then that's it. And children are just kind of there. They don't know what their role is or their place. And I think this opens an opportunity to create maybe activities. I love the flower idea. You know, we can't take those flowers, but let's go home and make some, and let's remember some of the people that are no longer with us. Or let me tell you about some family members that you didn't get to meet, and let's make something and create something for them that we can memorialize them and keep them in our memory. I think that's extremely healthy. I think it's a great way to talk about life and death with children who do have those questions, even at the early ages of 4 years old. And how do you do that in a healthy way? So creating your own, your own journey and own customs. It doesn't even have to be about folks that, that we've tragically seen die on national, news and things like that. It can also be about people we know. It can be about pets, but just healthy ways of creating these grieving opportunities for kids. So I think it opens up an excellent opportunity.
That is so good. That's so good. Anyone else? What are some other tips that you might, or even things that you have done in the past to kind of help children heal?
I think it's really important to make sure we're framing the conversations in terms of how people have resisted and fought back, which may not seem like an obvious connection to healing, but I think that resistance actually is hopeful, right? When you don't have any hope, then you don't resist. And so I think about even what Melanie was saying, when you come to the space, this is what community has done in response. When we're saying, say their name, we're hopeful and we're remembering that they mattered. And so I think it can be easy actually to frame it in terms of all these horrible things have happened to a people, and children can feel like, what's going to happen to me? And so framing it in terms of this tragic thing happened and may happen again, and we are still here, we are still present, we are resisting, and these are the ways that we have been responsive, and we're going to continue to think about that. And I think that is a really nice platform for healing.
That is so good. I like how you talk about resistance, because I'm thinking about one of the places may have been in the video that we were standing in front of, was this mural that said "You changed the world," and the mural was basically the quoting or paraphrasing the words of George Floyd's daughter that said, "My daddy changed the world," and she said that after seeing all the responses. The resistance from the community, from the world, the country. And so I think that is so important that we can begin to show children that they can influence people, that their resistance, their love, their support, whatever it may be, can change things. And for me, I think that's a really important concept to try to show children. And to maybe, if you're even in a place like that, to bring them there and to talk about what are some things or ways that you might think that you can change the world. So what about anybody else? Any other tools or tips or things that you might
I was going to say, I think
Mhm.
both of mine were taken, because I was thinking of, what Brandon said. And
Yes.
then with Rebecca's really it's that, how do you give children a sense of agency even that young? And so really this idea of what things can children just do in their own community to feel safe, or there are certain small actions that someone young can do. How are you getting them involved so they don't feel helpless? So
Yes.
is there a way for it to be more participatory? Is there something you do as a family that will help you think through some of these feelings? But I think in terms of the historic sites, we really do, you try to balance those stories, and you're talking about stories of agency, because so many times that's what's left out of the textbooks. So we're talking about young children where hopefully they haven't necessarily hit the structured school system that is telling them one thing about their people. And we're really hoping that they're going in with a sense more of pride and really understanding where they come from. So when these types of things happen, I think, as Rebecca said, it wasn't anyone's fault.
Yes. Yes. And that's really, really important to communicate that to children. So, we've kind of been talking about, how you talk with a child, bringing them to a place like this, or, an event happens and you want to respond. But the reality is, having discussions about racism is not really a one and done conversation. It's really, as children get old, developmentally appropriately, that conversation shifts over time as children get older. And so can you, this question is for anybody. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that? How do you continue this conversation over time as your child begins to age, and what message, and if you don't do that, what message is that sending to a child if you only have this conversation once and then you never talk about race again?
I think that it's something that we should have ongoing with our children, because as you get a certain age, your situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
Things are kind of different for you at certain ages. When you're real small, you don't face what a teenager faces. You don't face what a 20-year-old faces. So you have to continue conversations concerning racism with our children, because things are continuing to go on.
Yes.
So it's not like it just stopped. Like I grew up in the 60s, where there was the civil rights movement. Okay. I was young. I didn't know a whole lot about it. But I know that there was something wrong. Our mother would talk to us sometimes about things. And then whenever Martin Luther King would be on TV, she'd tell us, come in the house, we gotta watch Martin Luther King. He's talking, But I didn't understand what all that stuff was about, because I was young. But I experienced some different things coming up in school and stuff like that, and the way people treated me, because of the color of my skin and stuff. And because things didn't change for us until like 68 or 69. So
Right.
And by that time, I think I was 10. I was 10 then. But yeah, so I did experience some stuff in school. Like I had a young girl that I used to walk with her going home. She was a white girl, and she would tell me, she'd say, Cindy, do not come past my sidewalk, because my dad trained his dog to attack Black people.
Oh my goodness.
And I said, what? She said, yeah, do not come. I said, see you later, girl. And that made me sad.
Yeah.
I'm a young child. That made me sad, because it's like, really, who does that? And I talked to my children about, with Martin Luther King and all the different things that were happening. My children were born in the late 70s, early 80s, and I talked to them, and you know what they said to me? Mom, that stuff ain't true. None of that stuff happened, because don't nobody treat people like that. I don't believe that stuff was true. I said, it really happened, because they didn't experience that. So they were like, there's no way that stuff was real. I said, it was real. It really happened. And they was like, what? People really hate people like that because of the company? Yes, they did. Yes. They were like tripping. They was like, what?
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have to continue to let them know that stuff. And so now their experiences with stuff, because I have boys that are like, they big men, 6 feet.
I do too.
So yeah, so it's always biased from people. People are biased. They already got their mind made up for what you're about, who you are, just from looking at you. So we have to let them know that, there's hope.
Yes.
We have to make sure that we carry ourselves in a certain way, and make sure we pay attention to our surroundings, and stuff like that. So yeah.
That's good. Yeah.
I can
Thank you,
add on.
Cynthia.
I can add on.
Oh.
It's okay, Diane.
Oh, go ahead.
Just Cynthia mentioned that there's always bias, and I think it's really important to remember how you're like George Floyd was for the world to see. A lot of people recognize that it was horrible and awful, and other situations that involve people don't always have that same empathy. So how you talk about, you know, a young gang member that was killed, how you talk about other situations, children are making connections in all of those, right?
They
So
are.
you need to be consistent, and you need to kind of do that work about what biases you have about different people, and sort
Yes.
of that perfect victim that somebody, you know, it's okay to victimize them unless they're like this pristine image or something like that. So just sort
That's
of
an excellent
doing that
point.
check is important.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, because we do oftentimes place value on our victims, and we may not even realize that we're doing it. But yeah, that's really good to notice that and talk through that. So we are starting to get some questions in from our guests, and so I want to kind of pivot and start asking some of these questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with a question, and I think I'm going to pose this question to Brandon. What is the best way? What is the best way to support your child when they see you breaking down at some of these places? So as we mentioned that, you know, coming to a place like George Floyd Square is heavy, and it's a visceral feeling in certain places. And you can, you know, every time I go, I start crying. So if you're there with your young child, how can you support them when, as you are, you know, feeling your feelings?
Yeah, you're processing.
Yeah.
Well, one, it's always healthy to process, even if you're breaking down and you got the snotty cry and it's ugly, right? It doesn't matter. You should do that. That's really your soul just cleansing, you know, and letting you know that you need to process through what you're experiencing in the moment. And I believe that is healthy for your children to see at all ages, even if they're very young. You know, they may be like, you know, mommy or daddy, you know, it's okay, it's going to be fine. But they need to see that. And I think the most important thing is not to have any shame or guilt for breaking down at the, you know, at the location or in these spaces and places, but having that dialogue afterwards. What was that about? And being able to explain why you're processing what you're processing, letting your child know that it's okay, because really what you're modeling is that, you know, that there's something that happened here that was significant. I'm connected to this, which in tow means that the young person is connected to it as well. And you're allowing them to understand that, you know, you can be emotional, things can be difficult, but we can continue to push through. And I think that's the real lesson in breaking down in those places.
That's really good. Thank you, Brandon.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question. At what age do we teach our children that they have to go by a different set of rules, that there are a set of rules for everyone, but we have a second set? And I believe that means people of color have a second set of rules than white people do. That's actually a really good question. I'm going to start with Rebecca, and then maybe pivot to Brandon on that one.
I would echo, I think, what you've been saying all along, Dianne, just that I can't say a specific age. I think it's young. For me and my children, I started early and just tried to make it age appropriate. And I always add that it's not that there's two sets of rules because one group is inferior. It's two sets of rules because there's a problem in the history and the system that we're working on.
Yes.
So I think I start young and try to just continue the conversation as they get older.
That's good. And it's so important. I want to emphasize this, to be able to say these things in a way that our young children of color are not internalizing it, and that they're not feeling like there is something wrong with them. And that is why, or something wrong with people of color. And that is why we have a separate set of rules. So that's really good to make sure that you're saying it's nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with the system. Yeah. Thanks. Brandon, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't teach my children that there's different rules, but there are different expectations in how people treat. And I think depending on the age, we'll have a different type of conversation. So My age range for my children is 9, 6, and 7 months. And my 9 and 6-year-old, they started off with skin tones, hair, things of that nature. So that was the appropriate conversation. Your hair looks different than some of your peers, some of your classmates, even some of your classmates that look the same as you have different skin tones because they have different ethnicities than you are, but their skin tone may be darker than yours. So understanding that, talking about the differences and the uniquenesses and not letting them think that there's anything inferior. We have to understand that when we talk about systems, it's everything. It's the books that we bring into our homes. It's the things that are being taught at class. It's the Disney films and things that we watch. Like, they're getting these messages from all around. It's not just the interactions that they have, with police officers and other folks in the neighborhood. So you're always doing this consistent kind of counter narrative to things, making them feel like they're inferior or bad. And I do think that that's up to parents and caregivers to always give that reassurance and that encouragement to young children, to let them understand that just because they look different doesn't mean that it's worse or bad or anything. It's just, that's just who you are, baby girl.
Yes, exactly. And I love what you said when your children asked you a question. And so part of that answer is, if your child asks you a question about a different set of rules or different set of expectations, it's time to talk about it.
Have an answer.
Yes, because they are noticing something has happened, or they are noticing something that needs to be addressed. So that's real good. We have another question. Can you provide some tips for parents and caregivers on striking a balance in messaging to your children? You don't want to create a sense of fear, but you do want them to be safe and return home unharmed. We've been talking a lot about that through this conversation, I would say today. And part of, when we talk about safety, part of the safety conversation for children of color is knowing how to act in certain situations, or being prepared, and knowing how to respond in certain situations so that they can be safe and return home unharmed. But I will throw that out too. What do others think about that?
I'm trying to have Shuri here, but I'll hop back in if anyone has anything. I think we have kind of addressed this a little bit, but what I would say is kind of what we were just saying about always, have some answer. Make sure the answers are age appropriate. I think sometimes we get caught up in the hype and the intensity of what's going on, and we give a little bit too much to children before they're ready for it. I'm a big proponent of allowing children to bring you what's on their mind and what they kind of understand. So when they ask you questions, don't be afraid to ask them questions back and just say, what do you know about that? Or tell me more. Where did you hear that from? And here's what I think about it. Here's how I see it. Or here's what you should do in the situation. And it almost becomes a dialogue. And I think we kind of got away from that with children. Children are supposed to be seen and not heard, and they lose a lot of voice in things. But when they're really curious about something, that's your opportunity to really step in and be that role model. And they're seeking that learning from you, and you're that primary influence. And in today's world, that's very important because they are influenced by so many other things around them that when they do bring those questions to you, please have an answer, because they'll go find an answer somewhere else, and they might get it a lot quicker the way technology works. So.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yes. We got to have the good answer, because if not, they'll go find some answer that's probably not, who knows where it comes from. Well, we know we have some more questions, but the time is just not going to allow us to get to them all. There is some questions about resources. We're going to be following up with some resources, books and that kind of thing, that people can use to help with these conversations. I want to just start by thanking you all for joining us for this Early Risers Live virtual event. It means a lot that you would take time out of your busy schedule to listen to us talk about racism in young children. This is not always a comfortable topic to talk about, so it says a lot about how important this topic is to you that you spent your time with us today. In many ways, Early Risers found me and not the other way around, so I thank you for joining us in this journey. I want to say a special thank you to each of our panelists, Melanie Adams, Cynthia Carter, Brandon Jones, and Rebecca Nathan. Thank you for your wisdom today. I'd also like to thank Sheila Williams Ridge, who joined me at George Floyd Square and Say Their Name Cemetery. And a big thank you to everyone at NPR that helped put this show together. Finally, I am excited to announce that the third season of Early Risers will be launching 2 weeks from tomorrow. I'm excited about the great guests we have lined up for this new season, and I encourage all of you to subscribe to the podcast now so that you are the first to hear these great conversations. Before we go, I want to acknowledge again the support from health partners and from Think Small in making today's event and the upcoming season of Early Risers possible. If you have further questions, I hope you'll continue to stay in touch and look for us on Facebook at Podcast Early and on many other major social media platforms. And finally, thank you, our audience, for joining us today.